Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Strength Coach Rants. I'm your host, Connor Lyons, and today we're going to be talking about training to failure. So today we're going to be talking about training to failure. It's a pretty contentious subject in the field. There's a lot of studies and done on it and data to support both training to failure and not training to failure. If you ask 100 strength coaches, you probably get 50 that would say, yeah, training to failure is awesome. And you'd probably get 50 that say under no circumstances should we ever train to failure. But in my career, I have used it. I've used it with myself. I've used it with my athletes. It's not something that we use all the time, but there is absolutely value in training to failure. And today we're going to talk about the reasons why. So to start things off here, there's really two different ways to train to failure, right? You can have what's called a physiological failure. I guess let's call it three ways. The physiological failure, that's where you just can't. Your body can't keep up creating enough energy substrates for you to be able to get through the work, and you just can't do it anymore. You can have a mechanical failure, and a mechanical failure would mean that you get so far out of position that the goal of training to failure is no longer there. Like, for instance, if we're doing a bench press, and I get to the point where I'm like 15 reps in at 70%, and I start flaring my elbows and getting my butt off the bench, that's like a mechanical failure. I'm no longer really bench pressing, so I have hit failure. And then there's like a mental failure, right? Where we're doing something for incredibly lightweight, and we're doing it for a bajillion reps, and you just get to the point where you can no longer mentally suffer in that space. All right, I don't know what to call that kind of failure, but it's just like it's a mental failure. You just can no longer override the things in your body saying, that you need to stop because it hurts so bad. So those are the three types of failure. There's kind of other types of failure as well. So when you're training, right, we have a goal. The goal can be like to hit failure, right? It may not be that we want to maintain a certain bar speed or whatever. We just want to get as many reps as possible so that we can push like the lactic envelope and we can increase our work capacity. Then we also have like your failure to maintain a bar speed, right? So if we are training for power and we want to maintain a specific bar speed, then if we can no longer maintain that bar speed, right, we have hit failure. There's other training, like if we're jumping, right, and we're trying to hit a specific wattage, and we know that if we jump to this height, we're hitting that wattage. If I can no longer get to that height anymore, I have hit a level of failure. I can still do reps, but I can't do them at the same level that we're trying to get out of myself or my athletes. So that's also kind of training to failure. And then you have like sprint training, right? If I'm running 20-yard sprints and I want to maintain a specific speed or a specific time, and I can no longer maintain that time, right? We've hit failure. I can still move that far, but if I can't do it in the allotted time, I'm no longer accomplishing what I'm trying to accomplish with these sets. So that's also training to failure in so many ways. What causes this failure? There's a couple different things, and when we're talking about mechanical failures, it's your inability to continue to recruit enough muscle fibers to accomplish the task, or your body is trying to gain leverages by kind of changing the angles of the joints. A mechanical failure is not the same as a physiological failure where we just literally cannot do it anymore. A mechanical failure is going to come from just getting out of position. And what happens is when we're doing exercises, if the load is too heavy for what we're capable of at the time, your body is going to kind of put itself in, it's going to compensate in certain areas, and it's going to go into poor positions in an effort to gain more leverage. And you can see this sometimes especially with beginners who are lifting when they're squatting or they're lunging. You'll see an internal rotation of the hip. And the reason for that is because you can kind of rest on the outside edge of your knee joint as opposed to having to fire muscles. So a mechanical failure is going to come as a result of possible physiological failure, but a lot of times it's really just like a strength issue and can be a patterning issue, just not being able to kind of maintain good positions while going through a movement, especially as we get closer to the higher volume stuff. But it is actually quite interesting. You'll see mechanical failures when the load is too heavy also. Have you ever seen somebody in the gym? I remember like early 2010s, man, those CrossFit fail videos were like all the rage. They were all over YouTube and Facebook. I don't know that Instagram had quite blown up the way, it did in the past couple years, but it would just be people getting incredibly out of position, even when lifting like heavy 3-rep maxes and 1-rep maxes, and that's a mechanical failure as well. So a lot of times it's just the load is too much for what you're capable of at the time, so your body's going to compensate, put itself into positions that are going to allow it to get through the work, right? And we don't want that. So when that mechanical failure happens, we shut it down and we move on. Physiological failures are different. That's where you're going to be, in such high volumes, and not even necessarily high volumes. I take that back. Your body's not going to be able to either A, recruit enough muscle fibers to accomplish the task, or B, create enough energy to maintain the effort levels, right? So we can have a physiological failure on a 1-rep max, right? That doesn't mean that we can no longer create the energy, or the energy demands can't be met. It just means that we can't recruit enough muscle fibers to accomplish the task. All right. And then we can also have those physiological failures that happen like at 50, 60% when we're training to failure. And that's when your body, A, may not be able to recruit enough muscle fibers to accomplish the task anymore because we've exhausted all the others and it can't reach for any more. There's no more to get. Or we end up, we can't keep up with the energy demands of the movement, and we can just no longer move the weight, right? So physiological failures can come one of two ways. Those mechanical failures, there's a lot of reasons for it, but essentially what it is you can no longer do the lift, so your body goes to compensate and we get in poor positions. Either way, like we don't continue to go on. We don't continue to force poor reps when we're squatting or benching or deadlifting going to failure, and we obviously cannot force reps when we hit that physiological failure. The other failure that I mentioned in the beginning of this is that kind of mental failure where your brain can just no longer override your body telling you to stop, right? Let's use, so when I was working combine prep, we would do, I don't know if anybody remembers those old Kaiser machines. I'd say old. They still exist. I don't know anybody still using them. I know maybe Pete Bomberito still has some. They use some over at the Athletes Compound. They still exist. I don't see them getting quite the use that they got in the late 2000s, early 2010s. But with the combine guys, we had to teach them how to suffer, and we couldn't do it with just barbell movements all the time. So what we would do is we would get them on this Kaiser machine. It's air powered. There's little buttons on it. You can make it heavier. You can make it lighter. I don't know exactly how it works, but what I assume is there's like a canister, and the more pressure builds up in that canister, the harder the movement is, the less air buildup, the lighter it is. But we would set it at a moderately high intensity, something maybe these guys could get for like 15 to 20 reps. And we would have them do it for 45 seconds to 60 seconds. So we would start and we'd have them go. Once they started to fail, like in real time while they're in the middle of the set, we could lighten the load. We didn't have to pull a pen out and make the weight less. We could just push a button and they could keep going. And what that drill or exercise was designed to do was just to teach them to suffer, right? We may grow from that. We may create more damage. There's definitely a lot more metabolic byproduct. But the biggest goal of that exercise was to just teach them how to suffer and override their brain telling them to stop. So at the combine, one of the stupid tests that they do is a 225 bench press test. And back in the day, it actually made sense, right? But now that we've gotten smarter and there's a lot more scientific knowledge out there, it's really a dumb test. It doesn't really mean anything. When guys are doing 60 reps, it's useless, outside of the fact that it's like a pissing contest. But what the data suggests is that everybody who's getting more than like 5 or 6 reps is failing somewhere around 45 seconds, right? That's what the body is like capable of doing. So if we can teach them to get in there and suffer and continuously like create energy and overcome that brain, telling them to stop, if we can get them better at that, we may be able to squeeze like 2, 3, 4 more reps out of them. The other kind of failure is just that mental failure and being able to overcome that. And most of the time that's up here. Very few guys when it's an exercise like that are going to be able to take themselves to a legitimate physiological failure where they just cannot do it anymore. You have to really get in there and learn to suffer and be in that environment to be able to push through that. So with all that out of the way, today we're going to focus on like submaximal training to failure. So we're talking about less than 90%. In reality, we're probably talking closer to less than 85%. Something that's going to allow us to have a decent amount of volume where we can really kind of push the bounds of what we're capable of, instead of hitting a 3-rep max or a 2-rep max or 1-rep max or that kind of training to failure. We talk about that at different days. So today we're going to focus on these sub-max work. There's even a couple programs or quite a few programs that are centered around this type of training. You've got the repeated effort method, which is part of like a West Side Influence template or a conjugate method. You've got 5-3-1, which is incredibly popular with a lot of football programs across the country. It's all based on 90% of your 1-rep max, that being your quote-unquote training max. So we're never really getting above 90%, even though the quote-unquote percentages are 85, 90, 95, 95% of 90% is still sub-max. So we're never really kind of getting in that, 90% plus space. It's all still sub-max. And you have the HIT method, like HIT, high intensity training method. And that's, very, very sub-max, 30 to 45 seconds of time under tension, essentially training to failure. But these programs all have some merit. I have my issues with the HIT method as a whole, but just, it still has value and it has its place within the whole fitness sphere. This type of training, there's a lot of benefits to it that are going to benefit, beginners, intermediates, seasoned vets. There's value in all of it. So the biggest benefits of this submax training to failure, we're talking about increased hypertrophy or growth. Last week we talked about, the different kinds of hypertrophies. We have myofibrillar and we have sarcoplasmic. This type of training, for the most part, unless we're getting up to that like 80, 85 plus %, we're really seeing that kind of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is fine. That's the biggest muscle size generator. The myofibrillar hypertrophy will make you bigger, but not in the same way that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy will. We get an increase in VO2 max. I don't know if you've ever done something to failure at 50 to 60%. You're going to be under that bar for a solid 30 to 45 seconds. It is a lot of effort, and it will have great impacts on your overall heart health and your ability to pump blood throughout your body. Increase work capacity, right? That's our ability to do work. The higher our work capacity is, right, the better our VO2 max for one, but the higher our work capacity is, the more work that we can get done in a given training session and then can recover from. So your increased work capacity is going to do a few things. It's going to allow you to get more done in your training sessions. That means whereas, we may be gassed out after hitting 2 sets of 90% for a double, right? That's sub-max volumes at max intensities, where we may not be able to get a third set. If we can increase our work capacity, we may be able to hit 3, 4, 5 sets, upwards of 10 total reps at that 90%, and that's going to have a ton of value to you down the road. It'll also allow you to recover a little bit faster in between sessions, in between, shifts in your sport. Throughout the season, it'll have great benefits for you. And then we have another byproduct is that increased strength ceiling. The higher our work capacity is, the higher we can push that strength ceiling. Now, that doesn't mean that just training this submax work to failure is going to make us stronger. We still have to be exposed to those weights, and we still have to get in there and learn how to move them. But it pushes your capabilities a lot higher so that as you do progress in your training, you're able to get stronger, right? So if we have low... just as an example, if we have a low base of work capacity, maybe my max is 100 pounds, right? But if we increase that work capacity base, I've been able to push that ceiling a little bit higher. So now as I go and progressively overload throughout my program, I have the ability to potentially get stronger. Hopefully that makes sense. But those are the biggest benefits of this submax training to failure. There are also some downsides to this submax training to failure, and the two biggest ones it can decrease your movement proficiency, right? So if you don't have an eye for keeping somebody in position and they're hitting that mechanical failure and we're not cutting it, like we're not stopping it right then and there, you have the ability to kind of forget how to move the way you need to. That can become permanent, right? Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. So if we are consistently out of position when doing these exercises, we're going to carry that with us, and that is going to become our new patterning, and we don't want that. Also, there is increased risk of potential for injury, right? I very rarely see people hurt like one rep maxes, even like 2 rep maxes. When people tend to get hurt, right, it's from those higher volume lifts because we're so tired we get out of position. And this is also kind of goes with that decreased movement proficiency. What we do in the gym is a movement cue. So if I train super high volume squats and I get to the point where I'm consistently internally rotating at the knee as I'm going down, that's going to carry over to the field of play. And now when I go to decelerate or slow down, my hip's going to want to internally rotate, which can be catastrophic on the field, right? So those are some of the downfalls. And if you're training with a coach or you have a good eye yourself, you can mitigate a lot of that. Like the odds of you getting hurt are pretty slim still, and the odds of it having any like detrimental impact on your movement proficiency, it's pretty low. So while there are a lot of benefits to this training to failure, I think we would be remiss if we did not just at least touch on the potential downsides and downfalls of this training to failure at submax weights. One more thing to mention as a potential downside to training to failure is something called rhabdomyolysis, or rhabdo for short. You probably heard of this before. There's been a couple athletes at various universities who have gotten rhabdo from being in very high volume, beat down training sessions. It was all the rage in CrossFit for a while. Lots of people were getting rhabdo, and training to failure can kind of yield some of this. If we're doing the incredibly submax, ridiculously high volume stuff, you could put yourself in a position where you could end up with rhabdo. What rhabdo is your body cannot supply enough oxygen to the working muscles. So what ends up happening is some of those protein structures, they die off and they break and they enter into the bloodstream and they end up clogging the kidneys. Doesn't happen all that often. It's more likely to happen with somebody who has sickle cell anemia. But placing yourself in those higher volume environments, it can happen. I have rarely seen it. I've never personally seen it. I've never put somebody in a position to end up with that. But it's still a possibility. I mean, to be completely honest, I pushed my athletes pretty hard. I pushed myself pretty hard, and we've never ended up in that space. I shudder to think some of the volume that these people were doing when they ended up with rhabdo and in the hospital with kidney issues. So just wanted to make sure I touch on that as well. Rhabdo is a potential bad side effect of this training to failure, but the odds of it happening to you, if you're in a program that's got a progression to it and we're working at specific percentages, certain weeks, and there's a plan, odds are it's not going to happen to you, but it is something that could happen if somebody's not monitoring all the variables the way that they need to. All right, so now with all this information, you may be thinking to yourself, how can I train to failure? I've seen all the benefits and I've seen that it could be beneficial to me in my training. How should I implement it? Well, there's 5-3-1. That is a very dummy proof way to train to failure, right? It involves the repeated effort method, and there's a progression that we go through, and it's a progressive overload, and the goal is to handle more weight and continuously train to failure, right? That is a foolproof dummy way to do it. Using the repeated effort method, we can do the same type of thing where we within our training. So this is how I like to do it. This is how I program the training to failure. We put it in on our either dynamic effort days or potentially after our modified max effort work. So what modified max effort work is it is right around slightly below to slightly above 90%. All right, and it's done in a way that we can get the most out of our athletes and get a decent amount of volume at those intensities without going to failure. The goal is not failure. The goal is to stimulate and not annihilate the athlete or the client. So, we're hitting, let's say at 90%, we're hitting 3 to 5 sets of 2, right? So 90% is your quote unquote 4 rep max. we cut it back down to 2 reps, and we hit 3 to 5 sets. Now, with an athlete that has a higher work capacity, we're more than likely going to be able to hit those 5 sets at 90%. With an athlete, who doesn't have quite as much work capacity, or somebody who is just a much stronger person who's like 1 rep max is much higher, we may not be able to get those 5 reps, and we'll know 5 sets, and we'll know as we're going through it. We can do it also, so that's our modified max effort work. That's what we do. We can include it just after that, or we can do our dynamic effort work and include it after that. So dynamic effort work is work that's done, with accommodating resistance somewhere between like 50 and 75%, depending on the lift, and it's all about speed. The goal is to move the weight as fast as possible, short rest periods, fairly light volume, and, very light like intraset volume. So we're talking about doing like sets of 1 to 3. All for speed, sets 7 to 12 sets depending on the lift. So really never getting any more than like 30 total lifts, which, is kind of high volume, but it's not throughout the sets, if that makes sense. So we can include it after that. So what I like to do is we hit whatever our main movement is. And this is absolutely not every day. It is 1 to 2 times a week for any given lift, and it's rotated. So we're not going to just consistently hit, sets of failure on the bench for like 4 weeks straight, neglect everything else. We may, on a lighter day, do it with the bench, and then, the next week it may end up being done with the hex bar deadlift or the box squat or something like that. So it's not just consistently, one movement. We kind of spread it out because, these guys are also, and girls are also playing sports. So we can't just crush them in the gym by hitting everything to failure after, training near and above 90%. They still have to have some left in the tank to go play their sport. So we'll hit whatever our main movement is, and then after that, we'll do 1 set to failure at a relatively light intensity. Now, these intensities will range anywhere from 50 to like 75%. Now, if you look at like the rep max charts, 50% is supposed to be your 20 rep max. That is absolute nonsense. If you're only hitting 20 reps at 50%, your work capacity is not nearly high enough. You need to really work on it. 75% is going to be closer to our 10 rep max, and still, like, the further we get away from 90%, the less this holds up. I have very few athletes that can only get 10 reps at 75%. So we'll have a progressive overload built in, right, with these weeks, and we'll start at 50%, and we'll hit that to failure. It's 1 set, all right? Next time we come through, it'll be 60%. Maybe it's 65, maybe it's 70, maybe it's 75, with the goal of hitting it to total failure and recruiting as many muscle fibers as possible, creating as much damage as possible, creating as much growth as humanly possible, right? So that is the purpose of this. You can include it that way. You can do just high volume finishers at the end of a lift, right? We're talking like push-ups, inverted rows, bicep curls, tricep extensions, like light work like that. We can do those to failure at the end of a lift. So one of the things that I like to do, and this is like super sub-max finisher type work, is we'll set up 4 movements, right? So we have the push-up, we have an inverted row, we have a tricep, like a band tricep extension, and either like an easy bar, fat bar, or dumbbell bicep curls. To be completely honest, a lot of the time it's the dumbbells, because it is much easier to both set up and break down as opposed to getting out 4 easy bars or 4 fat bars. Dumbbells tend to be a little bit easier, but it doesn't mean that we don't use the other modalities as well. And you'll start with the bigger movements, all right? So your compound movements are going to be your inverted rows and your push-ups. We'll go inverted rows. We'll take it to total failure, all right? That could be 8 reps. That could be 25 reps. Take it to failure. Walk over, hit the push-ups to failure, all right? These push-ups could be sets of 10. They could be sets of 30, depending on who the athlete is. You're going to take it to failure, all right? Then we go bicep curls, right? So we hit our compound pull movement, then our compound push movement, then we hit our isolation pull movement and bicep curls, and we don't typically do those to failure, but we'll take them anywhere from like 12 to 15. By the time the athlete gets to that 12 to 15, it's near failure. And then we'll do tricep extensions, and the same thing, we'll hit them between 15 and 25, which tends to be failure for most people. So you can include work to failure like that, and you can just kind of increase the total sets, and over time that's going to kind of work itself out, right? So I don't have to say, all right, now you have to get more reps. No, like over time, as they get stronger and as their work capacity grows, they're just going to be able to do more work, right? So that's like it got its own built-in progression. You can do it that way. You could, honestly, those are really the only ways that I would say to do it. Training to failure without a real plan, and training to failure without like a program in mind and a destination in mind, I think is an exercise in futility. To come into the gym and say, I'm going to hit whatever weight to failure, and then the following week, well, I'm going to hit this weight to failure, right? If there's not a built-in progression the way there is with like a 5-3-1 or using a repeated effort like template starting at 50, then 60, then 70%, I think you're absolutely wasting your time. All right, so you can do those high volume finishers where we're just hitting body weight and very lightweight movements to failure. You can use like a 5-3-1 that's going to have like a built-in progression, or you can kind of include some repeated effort work as long as there is a progressive overload built into your overall training template. I think those ways are fine to do it. What you don't want to do is what I said before. We don't want to just say, I'm going to do 225 to failure after I bench every single time I go in, right? There's no progression there. There's no real understanding of like where the end goal is. I just want to get more reps at 225, right? You're probably not going to end up getting more reps at 225. So find yourself a progressively overloaded template to work in your reps to failure, or progress them yourself, and it will absolutely help move the needle for you in a positive direction. Anything else is just a waste of your time. All right, so we've gone over the different kinds of training to failure. We've talked specifically about submax training to failure and the benefits, the downfalls, how we should do it. There are other ways to do this, but this is throughout my career. I've been doing this for 14 years now. This is what I've found works for me. It keeps your clients safe and yourself safe. It doesn't overload the system too much, and it allows for like progression over time, right? So training to failure should not be like the basis of your training. It should be a part that gets inserted here and there to help move the needle when need be. I would say early on, training to failure can be beneficial to a mechanical failure, right? Because you're talking about people with low training ages. Shouldn't take them to total physiological failure, because the vast majority of them are not going to be able to maintain good positions. But what it can do is it can help assess work capacity, and it can actually help increase that work capacity and increase growth. Making your clients and athletes bigger, right? Having them grow is going to have a positive impact on their strength, which is going to help them get faster and better on the field of play. So I think early on in training, there's value to it. I don't tend to push it further than maybe 5-6 weeks at the most, right? We have like a work capacity block, and that work capacity block, depending on how long I have the athlete for and where they are in their training, it can be anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 total weeks. And what that does is that lays the foundation for everything, and we can insert that training to failure there. Then we have to kind of get away from it, because it's not going to carry itself forever. You can't train to failure in perpetuity and expect to have nothing but benefits moving forward. It doesn't work that way. So training to failure will wear itself out after a while. So again, like I said, use it for a work capacity block. Use it to kind of bust through some, quote unquote plateaus where you're really not seeing the lifts move the way you want them to. Outside of, having them early on, be a catalyst for growth and work capacity. As you get into your training, you'll see instances where training gets like really stale. It can be inserted just to kind of wake up your athlete, right? Like for these 2 weeks, we're going to add a set to failure on the bench or the squat, just to kind of dig into your athlete or your client a little bit and wake them back up into the training. Because when you've got somebody, I've got a couple clients that I've had for a year plus now, right? And training can get pretty stale. It just does. It's the same repetitive stuff over and over and over again. Yeah, they're getting stronger, but the athlete can get bored. If you can include some kind of training to failure, it kind of wakes up the athlete or the client, the system as a whole, and it can get them bought back in. Plus, inserting it here and there, you're going to see like a little bit of a benefit, right? You're going to see that needle move a little bit higher. You're going to see that increase in work capacity. So, not something that I include all the time, not something that I think you should include all the time, but I think it absolutely has its place, whether we're in a work capacity block or a quote unquote hypertrophy or growth block. I think it can be incredibly beneficial. But like I said, wears itself out after a while. It can't be something that we just do forever. So, use it sparingly. Use it when you feel it's appropriate. Use it when you feel like maybe you could help wake your athlete back up into training. And you'll have some success with it. All right, well, that's going to be it for this week. Hopefully you learned something about training to failure. The main takeaways here today. Training to failure can be beneficial. When you use it, make sure that there's some kind of progression and plan. Don't live in that environment. You can't do it forever. It's going to wear itself out. It can be sprinkled in, here and there. It can be used early on for a work capacity or like quote unquote hypertrophy block. But you can't use it forever. And the biggest thing here when you are training to failure, make sure it is a mechanical failure, not just a physiological failure, right? So it like for instance, if we're squatting and all of a sudden we're squatting high or our knees are kind of buckling in, that's not going to be beneficial to us on the field of play or just like as humans in general. So, training to failure can be good. Don't do it forever. Don't let it be the basis of your program, and make sure that we use it to a mechanical failure and not just a physiological failure. Like I said, hope you learned something about training to failure this week, and we'll see you next time.